So while the character account might not have worked in its crude form, we might consider more developed versions of a similar kind of idea. So I want now to focus on a view developed by a philosopher called Harry Frankfurt. And I'm going to call this Frankfurtian compatibilism. So one way of thinking about Harry Frankfurt's view is it's a kind of sophisticated characterological account. So it's not really a character account since it doesn't mention character traits, but the account does focus on aspects of our psychology or mental life rather than, say, our agency directly. And so we can think of what Frankfurt is doing, even though it doesn't make this explicit, as is trying to develop the kind of project that the crude character account that we just considered is trying to do, namely to base free action, free will, and morally responsible action as things which stem from human psychology and things that can be ascribed to us just because they have a source, even if it's not an ultimate source within ourselves, within who we are. And in so doing, Frankfurtian compatibilism offers a way to resist the basic argument in the same kind of way that the crude character account offers. And if the Frankfurtian compatibilist view fares better than the character account, then it gives us even stronger footing to resist that argument. So a key thing about Frankfurt's view is that he distinguishes between different levels of desire. So at the most basic point, at the most basic kind of level, is that there's first order desires and second order desires. So we can use this diagram to show you the kind of thing that Frankfurt has in mind. So when we're thinking about the hierarchy of our psychology, the kind of things that we want, we have our first order desires and our second order desires. So what are first order desires? Well, these are desires to act. So it'll be something like a desire to steal, or I want to steal. These are things which are direct, like I want to steal, I want to pick up the pen, I want to drink. Second order desires, on the other hand, are desires about desires. So it could be something like I desire to steal. The content of your desire here is another desire. A first order desire, on the other hand, has as its content an action like stealing. So importantly, these things can come apart. You can have a first order desire to steal, but not have a second order desire to steal. So you can want to steal, but not want to steal. So you can suppose that a person doesn't have the desire to steal. So the desire is missing from their kind of if we think of this as a diagram of like all a person's desires, we can see that they're missing the desire to steal, but they might well have that desire. So you can imagine a person who's like, well, I don't want to steal, but I would like to know what it's like to steal. I want to be the kind of person who could steal. I want to steal. So Frankfurt himself uses the example of a psychotherapist who treats people with drug addiction, and the psychotherapist thinks that it would be nice if I knew what it was like to be a drug addict. He doesn't want to be a drug addict. He doesn't want to be addicted to drugs, but he thinks that it would be nice if I had that experience. And so Frankfurt characterizes the psychotherapist as desiring to have the desire for drugs without actually desiring to have drugs. Another kind of example you might think of is if you've got a friend who's a little bit messy, they're not very organized in their life, and they're always promising to sort themselves out. So this kind of person might be characterized as, wanting to want to sort their life out. They really want to sort their life out, but they just never actually want to do it. And this would explain why they never actually do it. So they want to be the kind of person who would sort their life out, but they've never managed to actually form the desire or the want to actually do it. So crucial for Frankfurt's view are what he calls second order volitions. So second order volitions are a type of second order desire. And we can see them here as amongst the second order desires, these second order volitions. So second order desires are desires about desires. Second order volitions are desires about which desires are going to move us to action. Another way to put this that Frankfurt uses is that second order volitions are desires about which first order desires are going to be effective. So an effective first order desire is one that actually moves us to action. So you might have a person who wants many things, but they're only moved by a smaller subset of those things. So a person might want to steal, might want to pick up pens, might want to fight, might want to cry, but perhaps is never moved by their desire to cry. They still have that first order desire, but it's not effective. All the other desires they have are effective. Now, those desires which are effective is what Frankfurt thinks of as the will. For Frankfurt, the will are effective first order desires. Now, Frankfurt also uses the term identification. And for Frankfurt, when we have a sort of mesh between our second order volitions and our effective first order desires, then we could be said to identify with our first order desires. So you have a person who wants to steal, and they want to steal. And additionally, they want to be moved by that desire to steal. They want to be the kind of person who steals. That person can then be said to identify with their will, with their effective first order desires. And so for Frankfurt, when we have this kind of mesh or alignment or conformity between our second order desires and our first order desires, then we can be said to be acting freely and of our own free will. Now, careful here, because when Frankfurt talks about acting freely and of your own free will, this is different than what he means by freedom of the will. So the phrasing here, as Frankfurt himself later recognizes, is a little bit clumsy. So for him, freedom of the will means one thing, and acting freely and of your own free will means another. You act freely and of your own free will when there's this sort of conformity or mesh between different levels of desire. But you have freedom of the will when you have a certain amount of control over your volitions. If you're able to want whatever you want, if you're able to control your volitions and decide which volitions you have, then you have freedom of the will. But for Frankfurt, importantly, freedom of the will is not necessary for moral responsibility. Rather, for Frankfurt, acting freely and of your own free will is what is necessary for moral responsibility. Now, one way to get a better grip with Frankfurt's view is to consider the two cases he considers of the willing and the unwilling addicts. So for Frankfurt, both the willing and the unwilling addicts lack freedom of the will. They don't have a control over what their volitions or desires are. They're both addicts. So they both have these desires or wants to take drugs. But the difference is that the willing addict acts freely and of his own free will. And why is that? Well, the willing addict has a second order volition that conforms with his first order desire to take drugs. So he wants to take drugs. He wants to be moved by his desire to take drugs. And so on Frankfurt's view, the willing addict acts freely and of his own free will. And as a result, can be responsible for his actions. But the unwilling addict, on the other hand, whilst the unwilling addict also has a desire to take drugs, they have second order volitions that are against taking drugs. So they're the kind of addict we might imagine sometimes who they take drugs, but they're helpless against it and they don't really want to do it. They don't want to be the kind of person who takes drugs. They'd rather not, but yet they're moved by these strong desires to do it. And so in Frankfurt's view, such a person is not responsible. Now, Frankfurt's view is interesting and very novel, and in some ways is both very simple and elegant, but also quite difficult to understand, partly due to his awkward use of distinctions, and also, I think, partly due to the writing style that was popular in the 1970s. And as it stands, it seems to give a nice way of moving past the problems of the character account. But Frankfurt still seems to have problems of his own. Even though he's given a more sophisticated account, perhaps he's also going to face problems. So one problem that Frankfurt acknowledges is the regress problem. So Frankfurt acknowledges that you have these higher order volitions. They don't just stop at the second order. So the second order volition is a desire about which desires we wish to be effective. You might then have a desire about which desire you desire. Sorry, so the third order is going to be hard to, a bit of a tongue twister. So it's a desire about a desire about a desire, which desire is effective. And you can keep going backwards and backwards theoretically. But Frankfurt thinks at some point that you're going to decisively identify with one particular effective first order desire, and that's going to stop this needless regress. But the problem is it's not really clear on what basis one decisively identifies. It's not clear how to make sense of that notion. Frankfurt kind of throws it out there, but never really explains it. In this Frankfurt's subsequent work, he really ends up trying to sort of flesh out or provide alternatives to that notion of decisive identification. Now, if you're interested in Frankfurt's view, it's worth checking out his future work on this and to see how he tries to get around this problem. But the regress problem is one that he comes back to a lot, and it ultimately ends up being a continual thorn in his side. Now, another problem for Frankfurt comes from cases of weakness of the will. So when we act from weakness of the will, we act against our better judgment. So you might have somebody who judges that, taking drugs is bad, but they also just kind of keep succumbing to this temptation and taking drugs. And on Frankfurt's view, such a person doesn't act freely and isn't responsible. But some people have argued that, well, actually in these cases, people can sometimes be responsible and act freely in these cases. Like, it's something that's under their control. Like, they may act weakly and against their better judgment, but it's still something they can control and something they can be responsible for. But that kind of case really cuts against Frankfurt's view, because it's not really clear how a Frankfurt style view is going to avoid this problem. Now, whilst Frankfurt's view is more sophisticated than the character view and gets around perhaps problems to do with compulsion, we might also worry that Frankfurt's view doesn't really get around worries about manipulation. So on first blush, perhaps you might think, well, Frankfurt's view gets around problems with a sort of crude character account because he posits that we have these higher order volitions. And you might think, well, you can't just implant those. People can't just be manipulated to have higher order volitions. They can, however, be manipulated to have first order desires. And it's those kinds of mental states that are the sort of problem for the character account, because it's that kind of motivational preference that we can have manipulated. But if we're dealing with hypothetical cases of nefarious neuroscientists who have access to advanced technology, there's no reason why they couldn't just, along with implanting an effective first order desire, couldn't also implant a relevant higher order volition. So you could have a person who, is the sweetest, kindest person and then they are manipulated by neuroscientists to have a particular desire to kill somebody. They're also given a higher order volition so that, when they wake up that day with the first order desire to kill somebody, they reflect and think, yes, I want to be moved by this desire. And then that desire might be effective. They might go out and kill somebody. Now, Frankfurt's view, as it stands, rules that that person is acting freely of their own free will and is morally responsible for so acting. But many people find that that's counterintuitive, and that, in fact, just as we would say that this is a problem for the character account, it's equally a problem for Frankfurt's account. So it's not clear that a Frankfurt style view can get around all these objections. But there's been many people who've tried, including myself in some of my published work. Most people end up abandoning certain aspects of Frankfurt's view, but there might be ways of rescuing the spirit of Frankfurt's view. Perhaps we can take some of Frankfurt's points and adapt them into a better account, and it'll avoid worries about manipulation, weakness of will, and avoid this worry about regresses. But we'll leave it there, since it's not clear Frankfurt's account, as he originally put it, is going to get around these problems.